as was mentioned, the TILSA gas project started a test security project specifically to look at things that would help states as they were dealing with test security issues. And John Fremer and I were very active and probably seminal in working with TILSA. At that time, Charlene Tucker was the advisor, and just saying, you know, we really need to address some issues here. They're technical issues or policy procedural issues. But anyway, she fully agreed. Sue Rigney at that time at the U.S. Department of Ed was very supportive of this too. And the states in particular, the 20-some states that are in TILSA, said, oh yes, let's work together with the two Johns, as they would call us, to help guide them through and develop some sort of resources that would be helpful to states. So what we wanted to do with the Test Security Project was kind of bring together the latest information, put together resources, make the states aware of all these different resources that were available, and basically just collaborate across states to put something together that focused on what we call the big three: prevention, detection, and then follow-up investigations if testing irregularities and cheating are noticed. But you know, we did a lot of focus on prevention and detection. So next slide, please, and I'll tell you a little more about these things. So during my presentation here today, I want to summarize actually one report in particular, as was mentioned, the Lessons Learned report, which was issued just of June of this year, written by John and myself. And so that resource was made available to states. But if you look at this slide, I want to point you to, these are the actual live links to two resources. The first one is the Test Security Guidebook, which came out a couple years ago, and then the other link is our Test Security Lessons Learned report. I'll tell you a little more about that. Okay, so next slide. This is the key topics that I want to present to you. So I want to give you some background on the project, on the contents of the report, and then summarize some of the key chapters that are in there. And this is not only me, but then John will focus on the really key chapters that give advice and recommendations to states on how they can beef up their test security. And as part of this talk, we want to make sure that you are aware of all this. There's a variety of resources that are out there, other papers and publications, as well as the reports that we did. Part of our report was always to capture what else was out there, make it known to state. So the next slide. And let me tell you a little background on this test security project. I think it was John. I'll give John the credit on this because I think the first time I saw this wave and a presentation was to the U.S. Department of Ed, who several years ago had a test security or test integrity summit. They were getting kind of concerned about issues like Atlanta and the Washington, D.C. and front page newspaper reports and all that. So they asked some experts to come into D.C. and present different information. And we started calling this the perfect storm. This wave symbolized what we were actively calling, and our state colleagues too, is that there was a perfect storm going on across the country in regards to test security issues. So next slide. And this was part of what I was referring to earlier. TILSA decided to tackle this issue, and here are some of the reasons why. Because, like I was saying, across the nation and in states, there are all sorts of issues popping up, and the perfect storm of 2011-12 just started growing, and it affected quite a few states And many of them that we talked with at SCAS meetings and others kept saying, we don't want to be Georgia. We don't want to suddenly find out about Atlanta and district that's been up to suspicious things for a while. So there's a lot of discussion about what's going on and causing this perfect storm, and certainly teacher accountability and pay increases related to test scores may have been influencing some people's behavior. The consortia, there was a lot of concern about how do we ensure test security across a whole lot of states over long testing windows. Like I mentioned, the press and news stories, the press they just love these cheating stories, and they go crazy with them, whether they're true or not sometimes. But you know, nobody really wants to be having to deal with the press on a negative story. And then these large school districts. Again, this was several years ago, and I'd like to say all of these factors have gone away, but unfortunately not. So all we can do is try to do our battle and deal with them together, meaning the work we do at Cavion, the work that states do individually or in a consortium. So next slide. So anyway, the TILSA Test Security Project started up in early 2012, went for about a year and a half, with John and me leading it, and it resulted in our first publication on this from CCSSO, the Test Security Guidebook, which was issued in, I believe it was June of 2013. This guidebook got a ton of attention. A lot of states were very happy. They've told us that they've looked at it, they refer to it a lot, because it's a guidebook to give guidance on things you need to be thinking about and steps you can take to improve policies, procedures, practices within the state. But others took notice of it too. And certainly what the guidebook did was it highlighted that test security was increasingly important, and especially in educational assessment. We already knew this in certification and licensure tests and other things, that there's been a battle with potential test cheats and thieves a long time. But in education, it certainly has blown up more recently too. You know, we heard over and over, states haven't had to deal with this that much, and this was sort of new. So what is the best practice to react to these, and you know, what kind of guidance could be useful? And so this guidebook was definitely, I'd say, a very useful document on providing, at that time, up-to-date information and recommendations to states. So next slide. So when the guidebook came out, we got a lot of attention. Actually, John and I did several presentations just on the guidebook at the National Conference on Student Assessment, at NCME, at the COS, at the Conference on Test Security we were just talking about, at ATP. So the guidebook was actually very useful, and we think it still is to states. Meanwhile, we're still talking with TILSA, and the states involved in TILSA are saying, well, this is good, but there's a lot more that could be done. We need more info. And we knew states were actually taking steps to enhance their test security practices. So we came up with the idea that let's do a sequel. This lessons learned will be, okay, what have states learned since the guidebook, and what are they implementing that's working? And so John and I, again, collaborated with states to pull all this information together. What was happening at the same time, though, is states were doing things, but there was a lot of other entities out there doing things in test security too. And it was amazing the number of publications and resources that came out between 2013 and when we were putting finishing touches on our lessons learned report in early 2015. So we decided, of course, we should include everything we can in our report. So next slide. And okay, so let's stop for a second here. I'll take a breather. And we'd like to hear from you, so please unmute. My question is, I'll direct it to you, Phyllis, but it's also to all your staff in Rhode Island. Do you have actual hard copies or electronic copies of the guidebook and the lessons learned reports, and have you and your staff had a chance to read them?
No, we haven't. So we're excited to hear what you have to say.
All right, well, okay. And we're going to... Okay, so sometimes the publication of these reports is a mystery. CCSSO did distribute some, and they told me that they had sent them to all states, but you never got one in the mail from CCSSO?
Not that I know of, but it may be here somewhere.
Okay, well,
yeah, it's sometimes things can get lost, but I'll certainly take a look for it. And now I know we can download it too.
All right, and maybe we can help you too by trying to get a hard copy in your hands. I know what we can do. At the end of our webinar, we'll have a Q&A session, and we can give you some tips on where you can find these things, because sometimes we know from talking with states they like to have a hard copy versus just an electronic version.
Hey, John. Sorry, this is Rochelle speaking. I actually have some hard copies. I'd be more than happy to send them one if they'd just like to send me. If you guys can just send me an address or send it to Tristan since you have her contact information. We'll get you. We've got several we could send.
Okay,
perfect.
Great.
All right, good. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide and talk about specifically the lessons learned report. So we organized this in a way so that it was sort of parallel to the guidebook since it had been so well received. And so we had a chapter at the beginning about sort of context about the project, and then a chapter on what I call the Lit Review chapter, basically summarizing resources and publications. And like I was saying, there was a whole lot that came out just in less than 2 years after the guidebook came out, so we wanted to update that. And then the meat of our lessons learned report, just like the guidebook, we have a chapter on prevention, a chapter on detection, and one on investigations. And John will talk to you about those chapters. So next slide. So that's basically how it's organized. We also, just so you know, the lessons learned report as well as the guidebook, it has a glossary of test security terms. It has web links and a reference list and just all sorts of things to point you to other documents and reports that are out there too. And actually in the guidebook there were checklists and all sorts. We created a lot of different things for states, like if you need to do a security incident response plan, or if you're going to an RFP and you want to procure data forensic services from your future vendor. We gave some sample RFP language, just a lot of good, useful things. So in the lessons learned report, our focus on prevention covers a lot of things. Certainly the focus on security standards as they relate to state assessment programs, focus on computer-based testing, some things that have been learned, because we've done a lot of security audits in states, and every time we do one, states learn, we learn, and changes are made. Uses of these various checklists I was just referring to. Security issues for accommodated assessments, that became a growing issue too, and it still is, and something that needs to be addressed. And then in every one of these chapters in lessons learned, we had case studies of what we thought from examples from different states on what they were really doing as a best practice approach. So next slide. So that's an overview of prevention type of issues that we address. In detection, important too, there was a lot of interest by TILSA in the states about data forensics. So what do you need to do to implement data forensics? What do you need to do once you're doing it, and be prepared to act on the results from the forensics analyses? And just what are the different types of data forensics analyses that can be done? So we summarize that, and there are some states who are they're way ahead of the curve and have been doing data forensics quite comprehensively now for some time. So there's been some lessons learned from those states. And again, John will tell you more on that when his turn comes. So one more slide on the examples of topics. This one has definitely been growing, and especially in the past year, it seems. And this is one area that states are probably the least prepared as on doing security investigations. So we were summarizing and sharing info on the lessons learned on implementing follow-up investigations, a model that states could use, what we think is a proper role for state and then district and possible outsiders to help the state, and then the case studies. And we've learned a lot in this area too in the last couple of years. So next slide. So that's just to whet your appetite for when John comes up, and he'll dig into the details on that. I wanted to cover one more thing here, and I've mentioned it numerous times. There's been a lot of activity in the last couple of years on publications and resources for states and others in the testing business. So I did the lit review and summarized up quite a few things. I want to highlight what I think are some of the biggest things that have come out recently, and those that really are having major impact. So maybe this is self-serving, but the first bullet on the Test Security Guidebook, yes, we did that. I told you about it. We just wanted to make sure it was included in the report, since it was the predecessor to this lessons learned report. NCME, just as we were finishing up that guidebook, issued a white paper on testing and data integrity. Very important document, and I'll tell you a little more about that. And it's something that if you haven't looked at, you definitely need to, because it's key. And NCME is a very key organization, professional organization in our field. The other thing that came out, which is a long waiting to get it finished, was the APA, AERA, NCME joint standards. And these standards started addressing test security a little more depth than in previous years. It's always been important, but this is the latest standards that came out last year definitely highlighted things on this. So we wanted to make sure that you're aware of that, and it was summarized in our lessons learned report. So next slide. I think here. I need to turn my page. Okay, a number of other things came out in the last year or two. The operational best practices for state assessment programs, a very important document. Again, we can talk about these more at the end of our webinar and guide you to how you get your hands on these different things if you haven't seen it. Although CCS has so published this, and it should be out there in states, hopefully. John Fremer is co-author of Handbook of Test Security, which was published a couple years ago. Another very important document focusing on this one topic. Test security in students with disabilities. NCEO even got into the mix and addressed this issue, and I noticed that they're still pretty busy looking at things like test security for accommodated assessments or for alternate assessments. There are some test security challenges, let's say, in that area. ACT issued a paper on states' policies and laws related to test security, which I found very interesting because there's been more work in this area too by states, and we think it's an important thing to have laws that support keeping your property and your program protected. The U.S. Department of Ed issued a number of things over the last 2 years. The Government Accountability Office, Office of the Inspector General, that Test Integrity Summit I referred to, they all have papers came out and a number of different things which you may be familiar with, or I'm not sure. And then there are also other things that have come out too, of which I'm sure one caught your eye in the last couple of weeks, the Fed's peer review guidance, and starting back up on peer review. It has a test security part to it now, and so that one's getting some attention too. I'm sure we're going to be talking about that at our next TILSA meeting, which is going to happen to be just next week, actually. So next slide. And so what I want to do is just summarize 3 very important things here. One was that operational best practices document that I referred to. So it came out. It has a chapter on test security written by the president CEO of Cavion, and focuses on not just test security, but things related especially to online assessments too. And it's just chock full of all sorts of guidance and recommendations on implementing best practices. So I highly recommend this report to all state staff that we have talked to, because this one is basically focuses right on state assessment programs. All right, next slide. I mentioned that AERA, the joint standards, the revised version came out in 2014. Now remember, the previous version came out in 1999, so 15 years went by. Well, a lot of things have happened in 15 years, and so there was a lot of need for updates. But one thing that really needed to be addressed more was test integrity and test security, and the joint standards focus on it as a validity issue, protecting the integrity of your test scores. So next slide. As you can imagine, the joint standards, the focuses on, I mean, it's 3 key areas: validity, reliability, and test fairness. And so these joint standards, a quote from it: the integrity of test results should be maintained by striving to eliminate practices designed to raise test scores without improving performance on the content of the domain measured by the test. So what they're really saying here is basically any sort of practices that just focus on raising scores without really instructional improvement and learning is not really the way to go. And certainly you can do that in various ways, like teaching to the test, or just basically compromising test items and helping the kids prepare. The key bottom line here is that any sort of cheating or behavior that reduces the validity and fairness of the interpretations of test results should be investigated. So I thought that was a good extra step that AERA is saying, is that not only do we need to prevent this and detect it if possible, but if there's any sort of suspicion or things that point towards that these test scores may not be valid, then it should be investigated. So this is very key here. And notice the reference to validity over and over. And it's a fairness issue too. All right, one last one then. NCME white paper, I mentioned this earlier. Greg Cizik issued this paper, and I won't read this to you. You can just read the quote on it. But again, it focuses on validity and reliability and fairness. And he threw in this extra, the other bullet, comparability across states participating in a consortium could be jeopardized by cheating. Yeah, that's definitely true. If and the worry was, you know, test items would get out, or one state might be the weak link in other state in jeopardizing the test. So it's a comparability and accuracy issue too on reporting, as well as a validity issue. All right, so that was 3 highlights. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. There was one more slide here on this one. Sorry, my copy was still the old one. So you can read this one too to yourself. Again, it's basically, you know, we've got these big organizations out there that are saying we really need to increase our efforts to make sure tests have integrity and scores have validity. Okay, now the next slide, a discussion question. So my question to you again, Phyllis, and your team is, so there's these resources, there's lots of other ones too. You might be aware of some that we don't even know. What resources have you found useful in your state? So you may want to unmute and we can have a brief discussion. Oops.
That we used Jennifer, who scoured.
You know, honestly, the test security issues really have only, I would say, in the past 5 years, really started to heat up, as you had mentioned. So I think we're, you know, really looking forward. We haven't done a lot of the analysis and things that other states have done, even, you know, in terms of item, you know, erasures and things like that. A lot of our work really has been done in terms of good training and support and prevention, and really relying on districts to report problems. So we're just really looking forward to hearing what you guys have found, the lessons learned, and get some tips from you.
Okay. Well, if you want any more information on any of these resources that we've talked about, let me know. The report, the lessons learned report, I just didn't compile a list of here's all these different things, but there's actually several pages, at least a page or two, sometimes more, of a summary of contents of these different documents that we're referring to. So like the test security handbook and operational best practices and other things. So you'll get more information when you look inside the lessons learned report. My take home.
Could I ask one quick question?
Sure.
This is Heather obviously from Rhode Island. Sorry, we're just used to being on lots of conference calls. Does your lessons learned document also include those things that you learn alternate assessments? Because those are structured so differently.
Yeah, there's what we've learned. Teachers are still learning on this, but EO has been very helpful. Remember that Martha Thurlow and Cheryl Lazarus are members of TILSA, Martha in particular, so they have input on the TILSA Test Security Project, the reports we did, and I highlighted some of the reports that have come from them on this topic.
Okay, great, thank you.
I mean, all states are sort of learning right now on dealing with this issue. It hadn't been really addressed that well in the past, and it's just been in the last year or two that NCEO is on the case. And if I want to go to somebody who I think are the experts, I go to NCEO and for this topic, and then they're looking at test security. And I know that actually I saw their names in the COTS conference. They're going to be presenting on this topic. So there's, they're still looking at it. All right. If there's no more questions, then why don't we move on? And I'm going to hand this over to John.
Good. Next slide, please. This simply says I'm going to talk about the lessons that are in the report on prevention, detection, and follow-up investigations, and then summarize. So next slide. Good practice to have if you're concerned about test security, and all state folks should be, is that you need to build it into the design of your program. Mostly the programs just run on until there is some major event like PARC or the switch to CBT. So it's hard to say that. People use the metaphor of painting the truck when it's speeding along the highway, but that's the way to do it, is go to the very design. All your decisions ought to have a test security element to it. The area where the biggest problems occur is in test administration. This is not just true for state assessment, it's true for all testing programs, because you go from a small group of professionals concerned about testing, and now your tests are out there. A whole bunch of people, conscientious professionals, but that's not their job. They probably do more testing than they would like, but they're not trained in testing. Hardly anybody out in the schools is. Another good practice is go beyond the ordinary use of erasure analysis. It's just simply not enough, and with the switch to CBT, it's even arguable whether answer changing in CBT has anywhere near the value that erasure analysis had in paper and pencil. Another good practice is don't just develop training materials for your district test coordinators and ask them to go to the schools and use those same materials, but develop special materials just for the schools, used by district test coordinators or whoever you have in the process. And also a good prevention practice is, which a good practice for anything that you're doing, is adopt the policy of continuous improvement. What do we do this year? What did others do? What have we learned? What do you learn from our report or this webinar? And how can you do it better next time around? Next slide. One of the most dramatic difference over the last 5 years is much greater use of data forensics. People are learning the term. Who even knew the term data forensics 5 years ago? A pretty small group. And now many folks are learning the term, and they're learning to use a greater array of methods. Beyond erasure analysis, even for programs outside of the main state assessment that are primarily paper and pencil. Erasure analysis was never the best analysis. It was only one of them, maybe number 3 or 4 of the 4 or 5 most widely used ones. Well, now we're doing lots of different types of analysis. We're listening to Greg Cizik, and our focus is on fairness and validity of results, not on catching bad guys and pulling their licenses or taking them to court or doing the kind of things that happened in Atlanta. That shouldn't be our focus. The focus should be on fairness and validity of results and making things better in the future. And that's really becoming the primary goal for state and district people. Another thing we see is, because that's part of our job, is tracking what's going on in professional associations, way more attention to detection. If you just listed the sessions at any of the conferences that John Olson mentioned, and also in a number of state meetings, you'll find way more sessions being done. And partly that has to do with my next bullet about research programs and publications. Graduate students are working on this. They're doing dissertations, reporting. They're going, often when they're starting out, they go to state meetings and then eventually to the national meetings. And another development, intriguing to me as a long-term psychometric person, is they're developing new tools. We won't have time to go into it in detail, but In a CBT environment where there's an economic benefit to the test taker to cheating, which happens in licensing and certification, is something called the Trojan horse items. How could you not like something with that name? And what they do in the certification programs, where they know their items are being stolen almost as soon as they're delivered to a center to be administered, is they allow to be stolen items, easy items, but miskeyed. And often when the people don't really know the subject, they just use the key that came with the stolen items that were purchased. And then they get good scores with the miskey, but nobody else does because they wouldn't pick those choices. They're not the right answer. So, and also to identify who actually had that test before it was stolen, which is called digital watermarking. We've been doing that in testing for decades. And it used to be as simple a thing as fiddling with a punctuation mark, a dash or something, what line it appeared on. And if you have a group working on a test, a committee, all of whom have copies, and they look the same, but each one is different, and one of them is the one compromising the test, you can tell right away who didn't protect it or was actually implicated in the process of stealing the test and trying to make money selling them. We don't get that so much in education. It's more if they're not doing, as in Atlanta or elsewhere, trying to make money by making the students appear to be stronger. They want to help, and the poor students need their help. They always help students. So they help them during the test, even though that completely compromises the usefulness of the results in evaluating what the students actually knew or how effective the program was. Next slide. In terms of what we've learned from working with states using, and others, but particularly in recent years with states, is you want to be very conservative in interpreting data forensics results. If you do it for the first time, you might kind of get caught up in it. Well, we really know now what happened. Well, you don't want to investigate every instance that's statistically significant. You only want to interpret the ones that are practically significant, where it really matters that someone gained a score they shouldn't have gained, and you don't want to lose. You want to win every time you go and take up a case. It's almost like guerrilla warfare versus the government. You have to protect every railroad station, every crossing, every airport, everything. They can just pick their targets and move in. You don't want to make a mistake and think that you're being thorough when really what you're doing is going beyond the worst of the worst. Only go after the worst of the worst. Never lose a case that you bring. You can look into it, but never start to take action unless you absolutely know that whatever you're going to do is going to stand up, no matter how many attorneys or others fight you. You can't afford to lose, because it doesn't only undermine your program, it hurts all of us in the field that are trying to see better testing and less misbehavior. The next slide about having a full plan of how you're going to use data forensics before conducting analyses. I think I may have first heard that from Greg Cizek, who says don't use data forensics unless you know how you're going to use those results. It will be trouble if you do. And be very sensitive to the need to change what you do when you change delivery, as has happened to so many states in this past year in the shift from paper and pencil to CBT. Most states had some kind of CBT, maybe pilots or something, but suddenly it became the mainstream method for the basic K-12 assessments going on in the states. So we've already shifted to the next slide. There are 3 places where if you don't know about them, I think it's worth learning. And after the webinar, if you want to check with me, we can give you more details. Florida has a very fine communication program with schools and districts about how they use data forensics results. What do they look for? What actions do they take? What should you do in a state to be ready? And they've learned how to do that because, and if you know Florida, They have a lot of big districts because a district is a county. So they have a lot of big counties, and their voices are always heard. And the state has had to learn, and we've been helping them with it, what to say, when to say it, be redundant, have somebody available, someone who knows, and let the states know what's coming, hold their hands while they're doing it, listen to them, and be willing to change. There's a lot to be learned from Florida. Recently, Mississippi changed their regulations and introduced legislation and got it passed to make cheating on tests by educators a crime. So that's a very major development, because in some instances it isn't considered a crime, or it's considered a very minor crime. And another development that is very good in the area of detection is doing the analyses before the scores are reporting out. Vendors will want to tell you they can't do it because every second is needed for storing and reporting. But if you decide they need to do that, then they will figure out how to do it, and that's the way to do it. Catch the problem before you reported the scores, because that's when it's harder to make changes. There's so much emotional affect out there if you are trying to pull back a score. So you want to try to avoid that, and you can avoid that if you kind of bite the bullet and introduce the data forensics analyses within the normal reporting process, not as an add-on, but occurring simultaneously with other things. So that's what the first two slides there are about, regular use of data forensics, build them into scoring and reporting. The last one just lists some of the methods that you should use in data forensics. The best method was the best method in the paper and pencil, and it's the best method in CBT if there are enough instances of students taking the same items. If you have a very large pool, you may not have enough students taking the same items to use similarity. But when you can, that's where you pick up everything, so it's the best method. Aberrance is sort of a technical term, but for a simple concept. Do you get the hard items right and the easy items wrong? Or are there several students in the same class that do that? Why would that happen? Well, it would happen if someone helped them at the end of the test where the harder items tend to be, and didn't help them at the beginning of the test, or didn't give them a crib sheet or write it on the board. And if you find that one or two students, they might have been homeschooled or recent arrivals, or just have a very different way of approaching problems. But once you start finding it 3 or 4 kids in the same class, there's a very good chance that something was happening other than the students doing their own work. Gain scores, if you have more than one reading on a student, are important in part because the media can do that. They can attain that data, and they can look at gains, and if they can, and it looks unusual or funny, they're going to tell you about it. And erasures are still valuable, very valuable in paper and pencil, and answer changes are of some value in CBT. Depends in part how the system is designed, but with CBT you can do a lot of different other analyses too, including the time spent on each item and whether that makes any sense. Next slide. I want to mention in the investigations area that something we've indicated earlier, there have really been very thoroughly covered in the media investigations. I live near New York and grew up in New York, so paid special attention to the graduate student on Long Island who was taking tests for people for a fee, taking not just the SAT but the ACT assessment. I think he also took some graduate level tests, and got caught at it and was able to be prosecuted because he collected money. There wouldn't have been any basis for prosecution if he didn't take money, because at the time he did it, the cheating he was doing wouldn't have been considered a crime, but they've worked on that. Atlanta Public Schools, we've mentioned many times as something, if you don't know a lot about, it's worth going back and getting beyond the kind of salacious stuff about the trials and look at what it is that triggered. How could you tell that there was cheating? And any person that looked at the Atlanta results could know absolutely know that something very funny was going on. You didn't need to be sophisticated. Another development is that it used to be said, well, you can use data, but you need to have an eyewitness or a confession. That is not true any more than you can't prosecute for other crimes unless you have an eyewitness or a confession. If any of you watch NCIS, as I do, you can do a lot with data and other analyses. Two other developments are the use of external investigators and bringing multiple expertise to bear. I want to suggest that I don't cover the next two slides. They'll be in what we send to you. But go right to, we're right on the hour. I'd like to open it up to see if, just to go right through these, Tristan, don't stop on them. And give our colleagues in Rhode Island to see if they want to ask us before we close down this session. So you need to unmute if...
Yep. So I'd be interested in, I guess, if we could talk a little bit about what are some things that states have learned or that you guys have learned around the preparation piece in terms of what could we perhaps be doing differently as we get ready to administer, as we train folks to help avoid these issues. Because we haven't had a lot of instances, or at least in recent years that I've been here, any instances in where we've caught overt acts of truly trying to cheat to change results. What we have seen is breaches in test administration protocol that would give advantages. So, for example, what we don't allow is someone to go back through a booklet, this is when we were doing paper, to say, oh, you missed these items, go back and do them. And there was a school at a time that did that. The principal took all the kids that missed items, brought them in a room, made them do it. Now, he didn't tell them answers, but they certainly had an advantage over other kids. And it's things like that that tend to be more of our issues, as well as social media and kids tweeting and taking pictures. So I don't know if you guys have anything you can share on either of those issues.
I can and be happy to. Do you have a hard stop in Rhode Island? I mean, how much time can we reasonably take before it doesn't make any sense given your schedule?
I thought we had this scheduled for 90 minutes.
Yep. Yeah, so we have some time. We have a half hour.
Good. So we can do a lot. Well, let's go to prevention. I think the single most important thing is to communicate to everybody involved in the process how serious you take the issue of following all the rules. And there are a lot of ways to do that. It's not enough to simply say we take it seriously, because everybody says that. But how do you communicate that you take it seriously? So one specific strategy is when district test coordinators are being trained, principal of the school or others in the school, if they don't now attend the training, or at least go to it and make a statement in the beginning that we really do care about it. So that's another, that's a thing that you can do. In the training itself, having examples in the training materials of what constitutes our practices in the state of Rhode Island, what you're permitted to do and what you're not permitted to do, I think is a very important thing to do. And my sense from our conversation with states is that district folks like specifics. What is it that they should be looking out for, and what should they be paying attention to and trying to stop? And I want to give John Olson a chance to get involved in this also, but just to say a thing about social media, making sure that students get the notion that social media is not something private. It's something very public. That's what social means. And just as there are lots of other ways you can get in serious trouble as a student and cause difficulty for yourself, your family, your school, your community by not following the rules, that's also true with respect to testing. We specifically, if you possibly can do it, there should be no cell phones available to students in a testing environment. If you already do that, it seems like the most sensible thing in the world. If you don't already do that, people want to tell you, well, we can't do that. The kind of parents we have, our students, their children must have their cell phones at all times. If we are very clear in the test security realm, they shouldn't be there. Figuring out how, if you conclude they must be in the room, then they should not be in the room with the students or in any way they could access to them. John, do you want to chime in on either of those topics?
Yeah, I think this is a very key one. When we've talked with states, we usually encourage them to put their initial focus on prevention because you get a lot of bang for the buck there. When we've done test security audits in states, we get to see a lot of things. We review all the procedures and print and training materials and other things, and then we go back to the state and explain to them, or describe the good things they're doing, but we usually identify some areas that could be improved. One area, oftentimes, we start basically with the state, because you're the ones that really have to send out the edict and be the example and role model for districts and schools across your state. But many times we start with the state and say, well, where's your test security plan? You should have a comprehensive plan that summarizes all of your policies and procedures and practices, your training materials, your other documents, and any related memos or things that have gone out to the districts and schools in your states. Many, let's just say most states, don't have a really comprehensive test security plan. We think that's really important. That's like one of our #1 recommendations, that the state should have that. Essentially, we also recommend that they should have somebody in charge of test security things so that they could sort of be the central clearinghouse as well as be the point person if an investigation has to be done. More on the ground stuff, though, besides the thing about cell phones, I mean, if there's one area that we see is very weak and prone to people taking advantage of, it's not just the cell phones. And a lot of the breaches and things, and I should remind you that Cavion worked with Park this past year to do web patrol and look at things, and as well as, we monitor all sorts of things going on across the country. Typically, first layer of a possible compromise was some kids whipping out their cell phone and taking pictures and posting it on Facebook or Twitter or someplace. And, web patrol or some sort of active system that the state or consortium has in place to monitor so that the stuff doesn't get out of hand once it's on social media is important. And right now we're really watching with these smartwatches that have come out and little devices that have cameras in them. It's still kind of easy for kids, if they want to take pictures of items. And I'm not going to say it's just kids doing it too. Sometimes we've gotten reports that teachers are taking pictures of test items as they pop up and putting them somewhere. For what purpose? Well, you can use your imagination. So that's an area that really needs good vigilance. And another good practice on prevention is we encourage all states to implement the two-person policy. Whenever a test is being administered, it doesn't matter if it's pencil and paper or a computer, there should always be 2 adults in the room, the administrator, test administrator, and a proctor, so that they can really monitor things, watch the kids carefully, watch each other. We just think it's a good approach to use, and we know sometimes it's difficult to have that much personnel in every classroom, so a roving proctor can help too, but really best practice is to have 2 adults in there So that was just a couple other ideas there, John, and to answer that question.
Any response from our colleagues in Rhode Island or other questions?
I mean, we do, we try to manage the cell phone stuff. I think, the most interesting one is probably the most difficult one, which is having two people in a room, right? Because even if one is prone to perhaps do something inappropriate, there's others there. But do you know any states who actually are able to do that?
Yes.
Given
It
large
ends up
number
being
of kids to test, it's
logistical.
really difficult to have two people in a room.
Yes, there are states doing it, and I'd say that the model of the roving proctor is probably more common. One of the issues we find in our test security work is, other than the things we learned from our security audits and our other projects with states, there isn't really a summary of what's going on. John Olson and his company probably does as much of it as anybody. But things that we'd like to know, like what is the base rate of different types of problems? It's kind of hard to figure out, because if you've had a real problem and it hasn't become public, you're not that eager to have it become public. So I think the watching, knowing that someone is watching, it's a very common analogy that's made in test security circles, the analogy to how accurate we are when we file our federal or other income tax forms. We do a lot better when we know that people are watching. And I love the example of what happened when the Internal Revenue Service declared that in the following year it will be necessary to list the Social Security number of anybody that you list as a dependent. And between the year before and the year they implemented that, 7 million children disappeared because they were no longer listed as dependents on IRS forms. So documenting, knowing that somebody is watching, because you certainly have cheating in Rhode Island, because every state does. That's one of the things Greg Cizik says at conferences. If you were thinking of doing a study to see whether you had any cheating, I'm going to save you some money. Don't bother doing it, because you do have cheating. Now, you may not have much, and the better your procedures, the fewer instances you'll have. And if you follow up on every instance, that number will still go down. But I don't think you can get it much below 1%. And the only reason that you can get it so low is that teachers and principals and other educators tend to be a very honorable group. So you wouldn't know that from media reports, but really they didn't go into teaching because they really were cheaters by nature and they wanted to undercut the system. They went into teaching to help kids, and that's their primary motivation. But you will have cheating, and the question is how well you handle it when it occurs. Other questions for us?
Hey, John, this is Rochelle. I do see one question in the question box, and they're just asking about Trojan horse items. Can you explain a little bit more about what that is?
Sure. So unlike education, where I think the base rate of cheating by adults is somewhere between 1% and 2%, in the certification programs, it's way more than that, way more. In the worst cases we've looked at, something like 50% of all credentials earned show some contamination by cheating. So it's a very major struggle by those programs. And I've come up with this intriguing idea, I think, of the Trojan horse item. If you took their test and it had a Trojan horse set of items, it would look like any other item, and you would answer it like any other item, and you wouldn't have any problem with a Trojan horse item because you would answer what you thought was the right answer, and it would be the right answer and you get credit for it. But if there were a set of items in it that were deliberately miskeyed, they were put out on the internet knowing that they would be stolen. I said before they put out so they could be stolen. That's not why they put out. They put out there knowing they would be stolen. So there's some set of items, maybe 8 or 9, 10, that when the bad guys or gals steal the items with the key is wrong. So for those, let's say it's 8 items. For those 8 items, typically easy items, when they get the key that goes with it, it's the wrong key. This wouldn't work so well in education because mostly people can figure out, teachers, what the key is. But in professional fields, information technology, medicine, safety, you name it, often the people who are trying to pass the test don't know the content well at all. And if it says that the key is B, that's what they're, if the key that they paid for says that it's B, that's what they're going to write down, even though any knowledgeable person would know it couldn't be B. B is ridiculous. The first president of the United States was not Ben Franklin, if I choose an example from our world. But if you bought a key and you don't know anything about the presidents of the United States, so it sounds like a good name. Anyway, when you have 8 items like that and you figure a score on these Trojan horse items, if you get a lot of them right according to the miskey, there's something terribly wrong, because there's no way you would pick these silly answers like Ben Franklin being the first president of the United States. So it's a very ingenious method. I think it would have some application in state assessment, but probably in end-of-course exams. And we don't, where someone who doesn't really know wouldn't know what the right or wrong answer is at all and might choose them. But I mention it not because I see it having wide application, but just to show the ingenuity that we're trying to show in the testing world, the measurement professionals at states and vendors and places like Cavion. I shouldn't say places like Cavion because there really aren't places like us, but I'll just say Cavion. We're trying. Where people see an incentive where they think they can make some money through cheating, they're going to cheat, and we're trying different ways to detect them.
Do you know, and I know there's not a lot of data because people aren't out there reporting instances, but if most of the, and it's cheating for a lack of a better word, because I do think most of the cheating, if you want to call it that, other than kids copying off each other and things like that at the student level, isn't necessarily the types of things that you'd see in Atlanta of teachers, groups of teachers, or any one teacher starting to change its answer. But it's more, oh, I didn't know I really couldn't do that, kinds of things. Like, I didn't know I couldn't say, you skipped number 5, go back and do number 5, or you might want to look at number 2 again, those kind of hint things that what is happening more, because to me, if it's the, and I don't think it is, the types of things that happen in Atlanta, and that was obviously a very large instance, but of that, then you're going to attack, looking at it in a different way. You're going to focus on multiple forms out there and things like that, and looking at analysis post hoc, and looking at the, all of the data data analysis pieces. But if it is more of those bad judgment, poor administration kinds of things, you're going to focus in a very different way, and really making sure folks are really clear on appropriate procedures and why they're important and all of those kinds of things. And we really have been leaning on that latter part in Rhode Island, because we don't think there's a whole lot of teachers or administrators out there being purposeful about cheating to raise their student scores. But I'm curious as to what you guys have heard and your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll echo my colleague John Olson on the benefits of prevention, and training is a very good investment. looking at what you're saying now, taking the occasion to sit with folks who go to district test coordinator training sessions, and after you've trained, talk to them about, are they getting it? I mean, do they understand why so much attention is given and what the problem is? So I agree. Training is the best place to try to reduce the amount. Unfortunately, even though I have a very high opinion of teachers, my wife is a teacher, my youngest daughter, and I've lived my whole life with teachers. Most of my career was at Educational Testing Service. They are also human beings, so they're subject to the same pressures as others. And I've worked on a lot of testing programs over the years. Every time that the stakes have been raised in any program, there's been more cheating. That's a fact. I mean, it's not an inference even, it's a fact. And if you're facing, we're going to start using student scores as a factor in teacher evaluation, or we're going to raise the weight given to them, absolute drop-dead guarantee there's going to be more cheating. So I still think it wouldn't get very high, so I'm with you. Put as much attention as you can on training. But part of the way John Olson and I and others at Cavion is you need to do all of those things. You need to do a really good job in training. You need to do a good job at detection. And then if you detect something, you have to follow up and not, I've been around so long, I've heard so many stories from the past where you couldn't get action taken at the state level. The assessment people would find stuff and be absolutely certain that this must be misbehavior, and you wouldn't be able to get approval to take action because no one observed it. Isn't there some probability this occurred by chance? Yes, there's a probability. It's 1 in 100 million. But if you don't want to take action, you will then say, oh, well, see, there's some probability it occurred by chance. But if you find something that's 1 in 100 million, in addition to everything else you do, you want to be in a position to take action. John, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I find this discussion intriguing, and trying to think, you know, what, just so you know, Phyllis and everybody there in Rhode Island, this is our first webinar, so we know we're kind of working things through, and we weren't sure what kind of questions we might get, but we were hoping we'd have a good Q&A discussion. My 2 cents I'd like to throw in on top of everything that John has been saying is that besides the whole package of, you know, the state taking steps in prevention, detection, and having something ready in case they need to do investigation, I think communications and being proactive are really critical things to think about and maybe move toward. And I say this because, again, our direct work, and John and I have worked together on maybe a dozen states now, reviewing their procedures and helping them through an audit review to really look at moving to the next level on addressing test security issues. And one thing we've seen pop up on those successful states and those case studies are that they do things and they make it known. Let me just say it this way. You do things like have their procedures reviewed and start addressing and making enhancements to their policies and procedures. They may move into having data forensics be more of a regular ongoing thing, and they make it known in communications. They may be doing web patrol or all of the above. Finished working with Hawaii. They did all sorts of things, and you know, they're in a consortium state, but they also knew they needed to take steps. But as part of their internal steps in the department, they also shared information with the education community on the outside and said, we're doing these things. We are improving our prevention procedures. We're using detection methods like data forensics or web monitoring to see if things are out there. They may issue memos from the chief, commissioner of that state, and say that reminds districts or schools, here's what we're doing, and reminding them that there are repercussions if somebody doesn't follow the procedures. And so having a proactive communication plan, I think, is actually a good thing. And sometimes it's enough to make others decide that they're not going to try to do something that's not quite right.
And I actually think, and I don't know what TILSA's plans, and we're not part of CCSSO in recent years due to budget constraints. But one of the big things that I actually think would be helpful is, so I'm sure you guys know, during the park testing, there was a big thing about, Big Brother spying on kids and looking at their Twitter accounts and all of that kind of stuff. And we all know that, one, that's all out in the public, so no one was drilling into kids' private information. They're putting it out in the public. But that there's reasons about test security and all of those kinds of things. And I think having resources to help states communicate with the public about this, that doesn't make it seem like we're out to get teachers or kids, or we're spying on kids around things that they're doing, out posting things. So I think in addition to kind of how to prevent it, it also is, get to your point, not only how to communicate with districts, because I think districts get it, it's the public that sometimes can misinterpret this as trying to go after schools and districts instead of trying to make sure that it's actually fair. The process is fair for all students, kids, and teachers and schools. Because if one school is getting an advantage, it's making it unfair for others. So, that would be something as future work goes forward, is to have common messages across states about how to talk about those things. So not only are our schools informed, but the larger public is, and the media. Who would like to make?
I will, sorry.
Go ahead.
I will carry that message to our upcoming TILSA meeting. You couldn't see me nodding my head as you were speaking, but I so agree with you. That was a very badly managed enterprise, doing in the spirit of fairness, trying to do a sensible thing, but they had to spend then lots of time digging themselves out of a hole because it got into exactly the Big Brother thing. I think most people, if they approached it with an open mind, parents, teachers, community members, if you said what you're trying to do, and using fairness, I think, is a great, great word. In testing, validity is a great word, but it doesn't work the way the way the word fairness does. People get the idea that it ought to be fair, and having the items out there that some can see in advance and others not, it's just not fair, and I think people get that. So as long as we, one problem now is there's a negative aura about the idea of doing it. So when you go into a group, there well might be folks in the group who already know they hate the idea, almost no matter what you say. But insofar as you can build support, I agree. That's well worth doing. And maybe John and I can help some with that.
And I'll pass that along to my colleagues in other states who do attend the meetings as well.
Great, great.
Anyone else have questions?
I can make a comment. If this is your first webinar, what might have been maybe helpful for me is for me to have look through your guidance book first, or your guidance and your lessons learned first, and then be able to ask you questions specific to that. And that might have been some of our own fault. But if you're going to do these again, I think rather than say, well, all this stuff is in my guidance book, if I read through it first and then highlighted my questions, I think the webinar would have been more successful for me.
Good input. Any other suggestions for us?
Some of the examples, like going into sort of what is a Trojan horse item, what are some of these other strategies, would be very, very helpful.
Just like schools and districts, like concrete.
Yeah. Concrete, yeah. Because we don't, especially because for us, we don't, it's not that we haven't focused on test security. We've done, I think, the best we can, the best we knew how, the best we've known how to do it. But so our knowing a lot more about these specific things is really interesting and very helpful.
Well, we committed in one of our statements to the concept of continuous improvement. So that's what we're going to try to do going forward. Because we have several already on the drawing board where the states have said they'd like to do it, and I hope that others, when they hear about it, it's sort of a strange concept, I think, because who else is doing a webinar on something to do with testing programs across a topic? You know, who's doing one about interpreting scores, or there was mention earlier of best practices in alternative assessment. Not so much. So we wanted to be a good example of what one can do. So thank you for your input.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We should put up our slide with our contact information, perhaps, Tristan. And Rochelle, these slides are going to be available to our Rhode Island attendees. Is that not true?
Yes, that's absolutely true. I will be able to send those out to this group. So I think we can go ahead and conclude the webinar today. Thanks so much for joining, all of you, and for the time. And certainly reach out to either of the Johns or to myself or Tristan if you have any other questions or concerns. And also, if you, like I said, if you can send us your address and attention to, we'd be happy to send you a copy of the guidebooks.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, both Johns.
All right.
Thank you so much, everyone.
All righty. Thanks for being there. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.